Good evening, everyone. I welcome all the members to this AY Basic to Advanced Lecture Series 17. And this time we have two eminent speakers, Dr. Nishisha and Dr. Rajesh Yadav. Nishisha is the one like the CSF Rhinoria, overthink about it. Now, Nishisha's name comes and its picture comes because he was the one in the earliest phase who popularized this technique and through his fellowship programs as well as the CMAs and the workshops he conducted. And I had the opportunity once to attend his workshop, and then he had this concept of, both the neurosurgeons and the ENT surgeons should come. And he conducted a live surgical workshop in my place, and a very eminent speaker. And to moderate this first session, we have Dr. Vikram Khanna, who is a friend of mine. And, he has all the credits. He did his MSENT with merit, and he finished his MBBS and MSENT. And then he has worked with all the stalwarts of India under Dr. Renuka Bradu and ABR Desai. So you can just think what stuff he has with him. And I welcome Dr. Vikram Khanna to introduce Dr. Nishisha and start the program. Dr. Vikram, over to you.
Thank you, Bharti Madam, for the kind introduction. It is my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Dr. Nishit Shah. He is an honorary senior consultant in ENT and skull-based surgery at Bombay Hospital and at Breach Candy Hospital in Mumbai. He is the past president of the All India Rhinological Society and the chairman of the Division of Skull-Based Surgery at the Indian Academy of Otolaryngology and Head and Neck Surgery. He is the program director for the fellowship program in endoscopic sinus and skull-based surgery since February 2007 and holds the annual endoscopic skull-based workshop at Bombay Hospital since 2004. Vastly experienced, conducted over more than 2,000 endoscopic skull-based surgeries and has 3 books, textbook in ENT, which is in the 2nd edition, step-by-step endoscopic repair of CSF rhinorrhea, and the recent one, endoscopic transsphenoidal surgery with Dr. Dev Pujari, his neurosurgery colleague, multiple book chapters and publications, guest faculty over many national and international conferences. So, Dr. Nishit Shah, I request you to start your talk and share your expertise in the management of CSF rhinorrhea. Over to you, Dr. Nishit.
So thank you so much, Vikram, for the introduction. And also like to thank Samir, Bhargav, Kaushal, and all the office bearers of AOI for this very kind invitation to allow me to talk to all of you today. So what we're going to do today is to talk on just CSF rhinorrhea, not on skull-based surgery, but we'll try and keep it a little more simple with just skull-based. Okay, so what is the etiology of CSF rhinorrhea? I think everyone's pretty familiar with this. That is traumatic or spontaneous. Traumatic could be accidental or iatrogenic. There could be high pressure or normal pressure leaks if it is spontaneous. So secondary to a pre-existing intracranial problem, or of course with a normal pressure leaks with one of these issues. How do you diagnose a CSF leak? One is, of course, you have a classic positional rhinorrhea. So if you bend the head, you tend to see CSF dripping down from the nose. And if you do a sort of different positions, you may even be able to tell where it is coming from. It is important to note that almost always it is unilateral and not bilateral. And despite that, many a times patients have been treated for allergic rhinitis for prolonged durations. Chemical analysis in the past depended on sugar essentially, but not very reliable. Today, of course, we took a look at a beta-2 transferrin or a beta-2 trace. And these are very, very reliable. In Bombay, we are fortunate now at least a couple of places that do this. Endoscopy, again, can reveal to you a little bit about the presence of a CSF leak. It may be difficult to see the site, but combined with the sodium fluorescein, it'll give you more clues as to where it is coming from and also confirm that you indeed have a CSF leak. The mainstay of diagnosis, however, is radiology. In the past, we would do X-rays or tomograms because of the absence of CT scans. Today, however, we have far better, more refined radiological investigations available to us. And essentially, we're looking at a CT and an MR or a combination of these two things. Whilst doing these, it is important not to forget to do a screen of the brain to rule out a primary or any other issues with the brain that may have led or contributed to a CSF leak. So there's a pretty good article that I found in the Indian Journal of Radiology by these people that sort of looks at the advantages or the different types of scans available for a CSF, and it's good review to look at. But let's look at each of these separately, right? So for us, always as an ENT surgeon, the CT scan has been the main investigation because that gives you your bone. And without the bone, it's very difficult to plan a surgery because you need those bony landmarks. So you get a clear definition of the size of the defect and the site of the defect. When it is combined with a cysternography, that means a dye is injected through a lumbar puncture, it does two things. It confirms for sure that you have a CSF leak because you see dye coming into the nose or into the cotton. So even a small amount of a leak is confirmed that yes, indeed you have a CSF. And two, the site is also confirmed. And this is especially important if you have multiple defects in the skull base, and you can get multiple defects even in spontaneous leaks. Also, if you have a lot of soft tissue disease in the sinuses, sometimes it's good to have a cysterno to differentiate it from all the soft tissue disease. The disadvantage of a CT scan is that it requires, of course, a lumbar puncture, and some patients may not want an interventional procedure or may not be able to, where you may not be able to do it for lack of a good anesthetist or anatomical or structural problems. And then, of course, you have an increased radiation because the patient will have a plain CT and then a CT cysterno. So then we sort of tended to use an MRI. Now, MRI, you can also do an MRI cysterno without having to inject a dye by doing a T2 heavy weighted sequence. And this with suppression gives you very clear-cut sort of flow patterns of CSF as it comes from the brain into the nose. And so it does give you a clear demonstration of leak. Of course, it is important that you have an active leak. So both for a CT cysterno and MR cysterno, you do need an active leak to clearly define the fluid flow. If you have large defects which include encephalocele, it is mandatory that you have an MRI because you must see vital structures that may exist in the encephalocele, whether it's vascular or neural. Occasionally, you get intermittent leaks, which are not easily picked up with very tiny defects. And then an MR may show meningeal enhancement at certain areas, indicating that this may be the site of leak, even when there is nothing active. Big advantage is that there is no radiation and no need for a lumbar puncture. Big disadvantage is that it takes a lot of time, is extremely noisy, and some patients just cannot handle the claustrophobia of being in a tunnel for 20 minutes to 40 minutes. And from an ENT perspective, of course, the bone is not seen well. And I think it is being worked upon that future MRIs, maybe 3-4 years down the line, will be able to give us some bony detail and maybe take a CT scan into a smaller role. So that leaves us with two more investigations, of venography and radionuclide scans. It has been seen that the transverse sinus may be occluded in spontaneous leaks, and there has been some controversy of whether the obstruction is causing the increased CSF pressure or the increased CSF pressure has caused the occlusion. Because once the pressure is released, in some patients, the sinuses have opened up. So we have not paid too much attention to venography. Similarly, with radionuclide scans, usually done with technetium, again through a lumbar puncture. More important actually with CSF leakage causing hypotension as against hypertension, especially when there is suspected drainage of fluid from the spine. It can, however, be useful occasionally with the CSF rhinorrhea if you use a material with a longer half-life that allows you to do repeated scans over the 3-day period when you have an intermittent leak. So just some examples of how we would tend to combine a CT with an MR cisterno. So a plain CT to clearly show you the defect, and then an MR cisterno to show you both the meningo and the encephalocele as it comes through the defect with carotid or other structures that may be associated or in close proximity to the defect. This is another case where you have, so this one patient had actually 4 defects: spontaneous leak, cribriform on the right, cribriform on the left, fovea on the left, and then again a sphenoid planum on the right. So 4 defects, and 3 of them were active leaks. So in that situation, it becomes really useful to have a CT cisterno, and I would probably in this situation depend more on a CT cisterno than a CT with an MR. Okay, so let's go to management. Now, with a traumatic CSF leak, you would usually go conservative because the expectation is that they would respond to conservative treatment, which would include bed rest, a little bit of head elevation, no straining. Of course, you could give laxatives to prevent that. Diuretics do have a role in reducing both CSF production and keeping the pressures down. The role of an intermittent lumbar puncture is debatable, and while it was more popular maybe 15, 20 years ago, not so much today. Antibiotics, yes, again, to an extent, a little controversial. Neurosurgeons are not very enthu, but I would think in most cases of trauma, there would be a need to give antibiotics to deal with other sites of possible infection. When do you operate? And that is something that really is a decision based on the amount of trauma and the discussions that you have with your neurosurgeon colleague. So if you have a very large defect, if you have multiple defects, if you have a CSF leak that does not reduce over the first week, then you're more likely to go in with surgery. If you see CSF that is reducing, even if it doesn't stop, over the first few days, you're likely to hold and wait. Transcranial, transfacial, or endoscopic depends on the site and the size of the defect as well as the potential number of defects. A spontaneous CSF leak, on the other hand, will always require surgery because these are not going to respond to conservative treatment. You do, however, have to confirm that it is a CSF leak and not an occasional ruptured cyst from the maxilla which is leaking. And you do that as we discussed earlier with imaging. Almost always, most situations, you will do it endoscopic. And if the problem happens sometimes if it is not active. So you have a spontaneous leak or any CSF leak, it leaks for a few days, then it stops. It again, patient comes to you with maybe a history of meningitis, but no active leak. You do a plain CT and you find no obvious defect. Because you don't have an active leak, doing a cisterno is not of much value. So you would have to go a little bit by the history. Is it left or right from the patient, and look at that side more aggressively. Try and do intermittent scans. And then, of course, on table, you would use a sodium fluorescein to detect the smallest potential leak. And if you don't do that, I would put in a carpet graft. So all the way from the frontal recess to the planum. What are the different materials you can use when you do? There's a lot of material, as you can see. The most common, for sure, that we use is fat and fascia. Larger defects, we would use pedicle flaps with cartilage. Fibrin glue is almost always used. Turbinates, both either as a separate graft material if you had to resect the turbinate, or as a turbinate flap, are done occasionally. Dura substitutes, I would think we do it more with skull-based defects than with regular CSF leaks. So let's get to a couple of videos so that we can move quickly. Now, with frontal CSFs, personally, I'm not too happy to have well-pneumatized frontal sinuses to be done endoscopically. I think they can be tackled very efficiently and easily with a bicoronal incision. And if you were to try and do this, you would need to do modified Lothrop And even then, you would see that the posterior wall is really quite far. One, to try and remove all the mucosa so that you don't have a future mucocele is not easy at all. And three, it is technically a challenging surgery for most people. So people then also made little holes and these sort of things to see if that helped. And to me, it made it easier. Now, this particular patient, of course, also had, but you can see when we are doing the Lothrop that the posterior wall is really far back, the lateral walls are very far back. And when doing a Lothrop, there's a lot of morbidity associated with it. You require a lot of post-op visits, whereas with the transcranial extradural repair, it's very easy. So this patient also was a young girl who also had a posterior ethmoid defect. And so we agreed to do her repair endoscopically. But by and large, I would tend to do frontal sinus repairs transcranially. However, if you have a hypoplastic frontal, so it's easy then to take all the mucosa out, or if you have a supraorbital defect, then I'm very happy to do it endoscopically. So this patient has not just a supraorbital defect, but as you can see, also a lateral sphenoid defect on the opposite side. So we had a double defect. So we're just going to show you in this patient the supraorbital. So of course, you start off with a regular fess, open up the ethmoid bulla, open up the sinuses. You want to open up the frontal sinus clearly. You want to see the anterior ethmoid artery clearly. As you know, you can see your defect is just above the anterior ethmoid and below the frontal. So both have to be clearly defined. And when you repair a supraorbital, it's important that you keep the frontal sinus open. So your frontal sinus must be open wide, and your defect closure has to be very precise. You cannot just jam a lot of stuff in there, block the frontal sinus and cause those issues. So big encephalocele that is being removed. And as you remove that, you start seeing the edge of that defect. Now, really the key to doing a good CSF repair is to get bony margins. So if you can see the bony margins on all sides, then it's much easier and more reliable to get that CSF repair done. Now here we had a part of the orbit which was still persistently in the way. So we had to use a drill. And so it's good to have in your armory these sort of burrs. And I really like Medtronics because it gives me the 70-degree frontal finesse burr. So I can really get up there and drill this part of the orbit down and then use an angled scope so that now we can see clearly right to the end of that supraorbital, clear all that mucosa off and have a clear view now of the defect. If you don't have a CSF leak at this moment, I'm happy just to do an overlay graft. Otherwise, I would plug it with cartilage or with fat. Given the angle we were working with, it was a little difficult to put a cartilage in. So we decided just to put a fascia in there. And you'll notice that when we put that, we are concentrating on keeping that frontal sinus open. So a little bit of fat just to anchor it at the base of the supraorbital, just on top of the anterior ethmoid. And that anchors our thing, fascia in position, frontal sinus remains open. A little bit of tissue glue on top, gel foam, and then a nasal pack that stays in place for 4 to 5 days. So from there, we'll go to a cribriform plate. So medial cribriform plate is one of the commonest CSF sites and really is one of the operations that a young ENT surgeon wants to do as his first CSF repair because it's like an easy repair. But we have seen how many ENT surgeons tend to make it into a very difficult surgery by excising the turbinate, doing a full ethmoidectomy, then taking Haddad flaps and trying to put it in position. And I think that the more complicated you make a surgery, the less reliable your results are going to be. This is how we like to do our medial cribriform breaks. So we tend to lateralize that middle turbinate. Very common site or the usual site is at the junction of the middle and the superior turbinate. You see that meningocele there. I also like to see the sphenoid sinus opening and just widen a little bit so that if there's any drift of fat or fascia down, it doesn't occlude or block that front sphenoid sinus. So once you've done that, you see we are widening that sphenoid sinus. Then, of course, you need to mark your area around that meningocele, which you need to debride of mucosa, and that will be done on both on the septum and the turbinate side. So we'll clear all the mucosa on both sides, cauterize that meningocele down. And again, more often than not, when you do that, you'll find that the CSF leak stops. You can then take off all that mucosa, and it's not necessary to go all the way down to bone. Even if you take just the mucosa and leave periosteum, it's fine. So use a gentle hand, take all the mucosa out on all sides of the defect, coming adequately anterior, posterior, and inferiorly on both sides. Once you've done that, you check again to see the presence of a CSF leak. Now, if you do have a persistent CSF leak despite the cautery, as we do in this case, so we find that there was adjacent areas which were very, very weak, I will then have to plug it with fat. So I have two options. One is a fat plug, as we are doing here, or second is to use a bath plug, like PJ would do, is to tie a string to this, put it in, and then pull it out so that it mushrooms intracranially. You have to remember while doing this, you are going to slightly widen it. So if I don't have it, I will not put anything in intracranially. I will just put a little bit of fat so that the triangular defect becomes more of a rectangular defect. So when you put your fascia, there is no dead space in there. And then we would put in a fascia lata as an overlay graft into position with, as you can see, adequately. The two edges must be kept apart. So within the two edges, you always keep either gel foam or fat so that the two edges stay one against the septum, the other against the turbinates, and not tend to collapse in the center. Once you've done that, you can add a little bit of tissue glue. You can add some more fat. You need a buffer. So you want to put gel foam or Surgicel so that when you put your pack in, it doesn't pull on your repair material. You then have two options. One is you can, if the defect is anterior, you can actually take a stitch through the turbinate and just suture it into position with the septum, in which case I don't need to pack at all. Secondly, if the defect is posterior, then of course you need to pack. Sorry, I'm just going to get my power. Need to pack and put it in position. Now, this same patient you can see 2 weeks later with a very normal looking nose. So there's minimal crusting, normal turbinate, normal middle meatus. And this is really the kind of patient or nose that I want to see with a medial cribriform break as compared to a more radical procedure. So this is another patient with a medial cribriform, but this is a large meningocele. So using a coablator, we've just sort of transected it off at the cranium level, stepwise manner, of course, ensuring that there is nothing happening in between. And then we decide to use, since it's relatively anterior, a middle turbinate flap. Now to use the middle turbinate flap, I want to use both sides of the mucosa. So we'll start with the incision medially, separate the bone, and then allow the entire the mucosa on both sides, medial and lateral, to come up as a flap. So once all the bones separated, which can take a little time and a little finesse while dissecting so that you don't get tears in it, be a little patient. Then we just check that everything seems to be adequate in size and position. And then because it's a big defect here, I will plug it with fat. So that's your fat plug going in, and then rotate the middle turbinate flap into this position. Now you could have done it as the earlier technique with a small piece of cartilage as well, or with an Haddad flap. Both were possible in this larger defects. For a lateral cribriform defect, however, it's a different issue because now you're lateral to the middle turbinate, so you must do a fess. So you have to open up the ethmoids. Then you know from your scan, like in this position, that the anterior ethmoid is here, so you're just antero-inferior to that middle, to the anterior ethmoid. So use your scans to already locate it so that you're careful when you sort of localize your site of defect and establish the meningocele or the CSF leak. Open widely the frontal recess and the posterior ethmoid so that you have enough space both front and back for your repair. Once you've done that, then I can cauterize the meningocele. And in this situation, you see that once I've done that, I don't have a CSF leak. So now I don't want to put fat into this, because to put fat, I have to restart the CSF leak. And the cribriform being a cribrose, thin, delicate area, you tend to open up. You tend to create more fractures and widen the leak. So when I have this kind of situation with no active leak after cautery, I will just put an overlay fascia on top. We tend to roll our fascias on a piece of gel foam. It becomes very easy to insert it and to unroll it. So you're not struggling with positioning and it folding upon itself, etc. And it works very well. Once the flap's in position, then you can put, again, tissue glue on top. Ensure, again, we're always ensuring the frontal sinus stays open, which is why you want it open wide. And then, like always, you put a little bit of gel foam, Surgicel, and then a nasal pack in it. So we'll discuss the post-op issues as we go later as to the pack for how long. Now, this is one of our earlier patients who had a very bad traumatic injury at the posterior ethmoid planum level, Ono-D cell there and sphenoid here. You can see on the cisterno there is fluid there. So we've done already the ethmoidectomy, and the force of the trauma was so much that you actually see part of the brain that has sort of been pushed into his nose. So that's our Ono-D cell there with part of the brain. And as we open into the sphenoid, you then see the sella. And you see the flow of the CSF as it comes in from here. And we start clearing up this area. You see the optic nerve now coming into view. And as you suction away all that broken, all that impacted brain and the mucosa, you then have a nice clear-cut defect in the anterior part. Let me just go back a bit. So now you see a nice big defect here with brain pulsations. The mucosa around the entire area has been cleared. Nice big fat plug goes in here. This was actually 15 years ago. So there was no Haddad flap at that time. And so we always did free repairs, but multi-layer free repairs. So fat, then septal cartilage, and the cartilage has to be fitting. So it's that 0.5 millimeter bigger than the size of the defect. So though it's a little difficult to get inside, once it does, it doesn't fall back outside. And that then gives you a really solid repair. And you can just put a piece of fascia then on top of it as an overlay fascia. And then again, pack it with a nasal pack after your buffer zones. Today, however, we would do it differently, right? Because we have an Haddad flap. So again, a very big defect, posterior ethmoid planum here. And now we do a Haddad flap for this patient. So we are taking a flap from the same side. You come at below the olfactory level till you reach the anterior part of the middle turbinate. Then you can swing it superiorly all the way up. Take a small lateral incision there so that you can rotate your flap a little better. Inferior incision is just above the coronal arch. And then you come all the way anteriorly. And the mistake that some people make is to take a narrow flap. They don't take it wide enough. And the second mistake is not to come anterior enough. So come all the way to the mucocutaneous junction. Don't stop when you see the inferior turbinate. Come all the way anterior. Then you join, of course, the two incisions. And the length of the incision will depend on the width of the incision will depend on where your defect is, how big your defect is. And while, again, I repeat, we do this more with skull-based defects than in regular CSF repairs. So elevate completely the Haddad flap all the way. This is based on the septal branch of the sphenopalatine, posterior lateral supply. It will remain pedicled at that point. We then took out a little bit of cartilage because I wasn't sure whether we need to plug it with cartilage. And also to have access for binostril surgery, we would take a reverse flap and layer that part of the cartilage if it is required, a binostril. Otherwise, you can just put a splint in. So we're just doing an ethmoidectomy here on both sides. Now you can sacrifice that middle turbinate and make it a little easier, or you can just open it like as a superior turbinate here. So we're just entering the posterior ethmoid. And this part we are going a little slow. As you can see, the defect extends from planum just to the posterior part of the posterior ethmoid. So I'll go a little quicker here. So now you see the defect. It's quite a large defect. You see the herniation of the brain there, and superior turbinate is being cut so that you can rotate the flap into this position. So middle turbinate, since it was posterior, we decided to try and preserve it and just work with this area. So mucosa being debrided all around the defect completely, and then the flap can then be rotated. So we pick it up and put it back against the planum and posterior ethmoid. So today for such large defects, we would always use a Hadad flap. Okay. So that's just the final part of the flap going into position. So let's keep going back. We're going from anterior to posterior. We talk of iatrogenic leaks. So when do iatrogenic leaks happen? More often than not when there is blood in your field. Your vision is poor. 2 in revision cases, because there's more fibrosis, the anatomy is not clear, or there could have been a previous exposure of the dura which has not been reported in the surgical notes. Turbinates or other structures are amputated, the anatomical landmarks are poor. Common sites are, of course, the attachment of the middle turbinate laterally. The fovea is more of a tough bone, and unless you have pathology like fungus or tumors that tend to erode bone, less likely. Sphenoid, less likely. And frontal sinus, occasionally at the cribriform, if you sort of lose your way while trying to find the recess. So this is a situation where we were working with the frontal recess and I got this little clear fluid. Not sure if it is CSF or not. So you sort of be a little patient with it. If it is CSF, it continues flowing. If it is mucin, then it has, of course, a limited quantity, so it will stop over time, but you must always try and define where it is coming from and see if it is CSF. So this is a patient in, the debrider drills had just been introduced into India and they were very keen for us to try it. So I was trying it and it was a very aggressive burr. It slipped and caused a small hole in the cribriform. Fortunately, we had a very big concha bullosa. And the big advantage of removing the lateral lamella of the bullosa intact is that you have access to the periosteum, mucoperiosteum. So we took some tissue from the floor of the nose and used that to plug, so we didn't need to give a separate incision in the thigh. And then the mucoperiosteum from the middle turbinate concha bullosa was used to layer that area. And being a traumatic leak, of course, it healed quite well. And you can see some glue being applied and it closed well. This is another patient actually where we had bilateral polyposis, everything was over, only the posterior ethmoid was remaining, frontals were done. And I was a little relaxed. I went into the ground lamella with a forceps. And again, old video where we used to go in and sort of do driving with the forceps, rotate it in all directions to break the bone. Had missed completely a low skull base on the posterior ethmoid. So when I removed it, there was a big gush of CSF leak. So, of course, the 2 things we have to do is 1, clear the disease, finish the operation that you had set out to do. And once you've done that, then you have a clear definition of the site of leak. So you go ahead and repair the leak. So really the repair of the leak to me has to be the last thing you do, because once everything is in position, then you don't want to do surgery anywhere else. So a little fat plug, a little fascia on top. Here we use fascia lata. And then mention in your notes. There comes the importance of taking an informed consent. Fortunately for me, I'd spent half an hour with this patient explaining to him all the different complications, including a CSF leak. And so I could be honest with him post-op, say, you do have a CSF leak. I'm sorry, we're going to keep you in hospital for 5 days more. But we've done a really good job and you should not have any problems. And you will find that if you're honest with patients, they really don't give you any trouble. So this was a patient with a large bilateral traumatic leak, and knocked off big parts of the fovea actually, with huge herniation of the brain into both the middle meatai. Extremely difficult situation. Straight away told the patient that you get a transcranial surgery done. This is ridiculous. Also a septal perforation. So to take a flap was another problem. And they insisted that we try at least endoscopic before going ahead with a transcranial. So on that condition, we agreed to do that. So this is only on the left side I'm showing you. This is all brain that's herniated into the middle meatus, not getting easily decompressed. So we had to take a debrider and actually debride all that brain till we were close to the skull base. Once we got there, then I could salvage a little bit of cartilage from the septum. We also managed, you see that perforation? So we managed to take bilateral Haddard flaps posterior to that perforation. And we used, that's the elevation, we used this cartilage strut just to sort of push the brain up. We couldn't cover the whole defect. And then we rotated the Haddard flap into this position. And we had to do this on both sides. It was a long procedure. Fortunately, it went well and we didn't need the transcranial. So when operating, what are important things? Anatomy, CT scan, pathology, be careful in certain things, caution around the middle turbinate area, and with powered instruments. So some difficult cases, frontal recess, I think we'll skip this since we've already showed you. I want to show you a sphenoid lateral wall in more detail. So this is something that we've now done over 30 cases, which I think represents one of the biggest series internationally. We've done 5 or 6 of them as revision cases, and almost always the problem with revision we have found is that one is wrong diagnosis. So they've not failed to see the defect and repaired cribriform or fovea. And 2 is minimum exposure. So just open the sphenoid wide and try to pack it without exposing the defect. So in these cases, we have to do what we call a transpterygoid or a transmaxillary surgery to try and get this posterior wall of the maxilla open, remove a little bit of the greater wing of sphenoid, so that even with the 0, you can then see directly into this area. So we have now, you also need communication between maxilla and sphenoid. So in these sort of cases, we have to then sacrifice the middle turbinate. There is no option. Otherwise, you cannot see both maxilla and sphenoid together and work on the bone between the two. So that's being done. The maxilla is already opened wide, removing the mucosa over the maxilla so that we can clear this part of bone. Clearly, that's the medial pterygoid bone. Sponge is just going into the pterygomaxillary area. So once you do that into the pterygopalatine fossa, you then can cauterize the sphenopalatine. And sometimes, especially like this, where you have a very lateral, we tend to use a binostril approach. Because you can't use a flap on the same side, you're going to sacrifice the sphenopalatine. We tend to take the mucoperiosteum on this side as a free graft. And on the opposite side, we just take a incision like a rescue flap just for access. And that keeps alive for us the option of converting that into a Haddard flap. Should we feel that we want to put a Haddard flap here, occasionally we find that the flap is not long enough to get all the way there, and we prefer doing a free repair in most cases. I think out of 35 odd cases, we've done a flap only in 2 or 3 cases. So sphenoid being opened wide here on both sides, and then we start drilling. So we start drilling both posterior wall of maxilla and the pterygoid inferiorly. Once we've done all that, then it's important to identify. So you see this view of the sphenoid, you see just the edge there of the encephalo. So unless you remove all this bone of the pterygoid really under the Vidian nerve, you will not have access to the lateral recess. So what we are doing is drilling off that pterygoid wedge. Posterior wall of the maxilla has been opened up. Sphenoid has been opened up. This is then the palatovaginal. We know that once we cauterize it, the Vidian nerve is going to be just posterior lateral to it. So we cut that. And just posterior lateral, you then see the Vidian nerve. Now we are going under the Vidian nerve to really get to that area. You see clearly the Vidian canal. So again, the Vidian nerve will be sacrificed because it will come in your way. So mucosa is cleared, all the bone is removed, and I'll go a little quicker here. That's the V2. So V2 will come here and open up. Oh, I'm sorry, I was about to lose my laptop. Let me go back. Okay. A little forward here. Okay. So that's the internal, let's go back a little bit. So that's the internal maxillary artery which has been cauterized. Last bits of the bone being removed here. You see the Vidian nerve. I'm sorry, I don't know why this is happening. Last bits of the bone being removed. So now you see the Vidian nerve completely open. And under the Vidian and laterally, once you've taken out all that, you see the recess. The upper limit is the foramen rotundum. So that is V2. So you can define the rotundum and remove bone all the way up to there. Then once you've done that, then you have now a straight view of the meningoencephalocele and you can remove it under vision using a 0 degree. So you don't have to angle scopes, you don't need angled instruments, and it's a very straightforward surgery. Remember, there is mucosa lateral to the defect. And so that exposure is very important that you remove not just the encephalocele, but also mucosa lateral to the defect. As you mentioned earlier, define completely and clearly the bony area or the bony defect. And then we can put in a piece of cartilage, plug it with cartilage. So that's the bone cartilage going in. And then we use the mucoperiosteum from the septum as a free graft. So you can do this or take a Hadad from the opposite side and use that. And then mucosa goes back. So that's your thing. Clivus leaks, I think again, we'll skip this for a time period, or maybe we can just show you the actual closure. So sella clivus leak only seen on sagittal and axial. You miss it completely on a coronal. You see the meningocele there. We had to open it up. We had to cauterize it. And because it was too small to plug a fat in, I had to just, with a drill, make it slightly wider. This is with great caution because your basilar artery, as you can see, is just behind. And then you can do a fat plug. So actually, it's good for me to show you this because you can see a fat plug. So you can see that the string is tied to this fat. The entire fat is then put inside. The string is tied to the apex of that fat plug. So when you pull that fat plug in, it tends to mushroom onto the bone. So now you'll see that the string is being pulled and then it mushrooms and then you can cut it. And then of course you put a small, in this case we use a short Hadad flap or a mini Hadad flap to close it. Okay, congenital defects such as these very large things, extremely difficult. It also contains a lot of vital tissue. For example, the third ventricle itself is here. And you must do this. For us, we do all CSFs in collaboration with the neurosurgical defect, with the neurosurgical team. For us, it's just protocol. But if there is any intracranial issue, then it's mandatory that you have a neurosurgeon with you. What are the conflicts? I think we'll skip this. So intra-op consideration. So last few slides, whether we excise the turbinate for doing these procedures. And I think if you go lateral, you do coronal surgery like lateral sphenoid, you must take the turbinate. But if you do cribriform, I think it's excess to take the turbinate. Local flaps you will use only if there are big defects. For small defects, always free flaps. Tissue glue always. Sodium fluorescein only in difficult to diagnose or recurrent cases. Lumbar drain only if required. So this was a patient who had a surgery done when he was 5 years old, a congenital defect of the lateral sphenoid wall. Then got 2 episodes of meningitis, 2 scans, both where he migrated to Australia and in India, showed no defect, no leak. Endoscopy showed no leak. So we went in with fluorescein and then kept him, of course, prone for half an hour before we operated. And that fluorescein, then we could sort of trace back to find finally that there was a small rent in that inferior part of that original defect. And we could then just do a small plug instead of having to open up everything and close it. So what are the post-op factors? Antibiotics, the neurosurgeons again tend to stop earlier. We tend to continue because I don't want nasal infection, so nasal crusting, because the entire surgery has gone through the nose. Again, we used to give bed rest for 5 days. Things are changing. We are tending to mobilize a little quicker. So day 1 is 30 degrees. Day 4 for me is 45. Day 3 is sitting position. And day 4 is walking. We are, as we get comfortable in this, where we will hope to start patients walking even on day 2 or day 3. Nasal spray and douching if the nasal cavity has not been packed completely, so that you keep crusting at a minimum. And of course, post-op endoscopic checks, both for cleaning and for the presence of a leak. Travel, we generally say 2 or 3 weeks post-op for flights, and heavy exercise, of course, few months later. And finally, just a big thank you to Dr. Kirtane, whom I have learned all my CSF leaks from, and who really is pretty much, I would say, the international master for CSF repairs. Thank you once again to all of you, and thank you to AOI for this opportunity. And I think we're pretty much done in 45 minutes. So let me stop sharing. Just one more thing before I stop sharing. For those of you interested in transsphenoid surgery, we do have this very nice book, Practical Guide, more on practical aspects than theory aspects, which are written with Dr. Devpujari, my neurosurgical colleague, and Dr. Sai Spurti, who was my fellow. She's from Goa. And it's a really good book for beginners who want to start learning transsphenoid surgery. Okay, thank you, everyone. So I don't know if you have time for questions now or we're doing it later. Hello, moderator.
Hello, Dr. Vikram. Hello, Vikram? ಅದನ್ನಷ್ಟೇ ಹಾಕೋಪ್ಪ.
Am I audible now?
Yep.
Yeah, Vikram, you're all
Am I audible?
Yeah.
And unmasked.
Hello? Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, there are a few questions for Dr. Nishit.
Sure.
Sir, the first question is from our president, Dr. Samir Bhargav. For spontaneous leaks for benign intracranial hypertension and empty sella, what are the approaches to prevent recurrences and new leaks?
Yeah, thanks, Samir. Excellent question, and one we always get asked. So as a routine, we will always do an intra-op lumbar puncture on these patients because we want to measure the pressure of the CSF. If the pressures are very high, so like above 30, then we know that the chance of getting a failure is much higher than in a normal situation. Also, we will talk to the patient about the possibility of putting in a shunt to prevent recurrences or to prevent a second surgery from another site happening in future. Between 20 and 30, we would tend to put in a lumbar drain for a couple of days to allow for decreased pressure. And if the pressure is not too bad, I would say below 22, 23, then we would just treat it like a normal CSF without anything else. Does that answer your question, Samir?
Yeah, but Nishit, if the patient has been operated and then continues to complain of headaches, and of course it's still showing the empty sella, then you are worried that it will give way, at some point of time. So send the patient for a shunt, or what do you do?
Yeah, so one of the most important things is weight loss. Most of these patients will be obese. So they must get on a program, diet and exercise where they can lose weight. And I think that is one of the major factors of settling patients down. If there is no headache, but the pressures are remaining high, we'd probably just wait and watch and do nothing else. If there is persistent headaches, then of course they go back to the neuro colleagues for further management.
Thanks.
Yeah, the second question is from Dr. Prakash Munka from Bokaro Steel City. There are two questions from his side. His first question is, what is your site for taking the fat that you used for the plug? And how do you ensure that the fat stays in place? Is there any tip or trick that you would like to share with us?
So we like to take the lateral thigh because we also have access to fascia over there, should it be required. And I think almost always we would use fascia, not just fat alone. So it's nice to have the thigh open. Tips is that the fat should not be very small or in fragments. It's better to put in a nice single piece of fat that goes in maybe a little bigger than the size of the defect, and use an instrument that has not got a round tip. So I see a lot of people using a ball tip to put it in. The ball tips tend to not only widen the opening, but pull the fat back out. So we use a fine dissector, something which is flat, like your finger, so that it can be pushed in easily and then put in under pressure. A fat plug is a very good way, secure way of ensuring that the fat is in position and unlikely to come out. But it's not necessary. Sometimes a fat plug is enough.
Yeah. For extremely small defects, there is a question from Dr. Rajesh Yadav, our next speaker. Have you ever used pinna fat?
Yeah, we've done it once, but generally, again, because I always have the thigh open for fascia, it doesn't make sense for me to take it from anywhere else.
Yeah. Between the overlay grafting technique and the underlay technique, which do you prefer and what are your reasons to choose?
So if you have a large defect and you're going to multi-layer it, then you will have underlay and overlay. Small defects without a big dural defect, only overlay. I don't want to increase the dural defect. To put in an underlay, either you have to go into the dura, or then you have to try and separate dura from the bone, which itself is got two potential risks. Either you increase the size of the dural defect and cause more CSF, or a small risk of a vascular injury when doing that, which becomes difficult to control.
There is an observation by Dr. Prakash Munka who feels that you use the cautery more than the cobblator. Is he right?
Well, I would say that the cobblator I have started using in the nose probably in the last 1 year.
Okay.
Not so much. Also, the tip of the cobblator is huge compared to a fine bipolar.
Okay.
So a bipolar for sure is a preferred instrument at skull base than a cobblator.
There's a query from Dr. Ishan from Thrissur. What would be the difference between a foveal leak and a lateral cribriform plate leak?
So the cribriform plate, I think this is anatomy, is the medial cribriform. Then it goes up like that, where you have the middle turbinate attached, and then it becomes the fovea. Now the fovea is 10 times thicker bone than the lateral cribriform. So the lateral cribriform is that part, the thin part, which is still attached to the middle turbinate, but on the lateral side. The medial part is the medial cribriform, and then more lateral is the fovea.
Okay.
Much thinner bone.
Dr. Pawan Singhal from Jaipur wishes to ask, what are your real indications for external approach, or is it endoscopic always?
So, well, let's go put it this way. The more posterior you are, the more ideal for endoscopy. The more anterior you are, the easier for transcranial. So for patients with frontal sinus, well pneumatized frontal sinuses, big defects, I think it's very easy to go bicoronal. And once you're done with the surgery, in 1 week you're done. There's no post-op care. There's no jhanjat of modified Lothrop, crusting, closure, all that. So I find it's a much easier operation for the frontal sinus. For everything else, endoscopy is easier. If the patient insists on endoscopy for frontal, only then I will do it. But after having this discussion with the patient about pros and cons.
Okay. The final question for you is that if a patient is not willing for lumbar puncture, then what is the one investigation you would do for diagnosis? CT scan, cysternography, or MRI with CT plain?
So both are two investigations. A CT cysterno is 2 investigations and an MR with
Either
CT
of the
is
two.
2
The
investigations.
question is whether you do CT cysterno or MRI CT for a patient not willing for lumbar puncture.
I think today we have sort of migrated more towards a plain CT with an MR cysterno.
Okay.
In situations where I'm not sure if I'm going to get a good MR, then I might do an MR cysterno, CT cysterno. Or
Okay.
if I have multiple breaks or fractures, I will do a CT cysterno.
Okay, so I think that sums up all our questions. And Dr. Nishit, thank you very much for a very elaborative and a very clear, giving us a clear picture of the various situations and the surgical approaches and how to manage, plus the few tips and tricks for various dealing with various pathologies and the indications for external approach. I would hand over the session to Dr.
Yeah,
Bharti.
sorry, I rushed through some of the videos, but I had been threatened to keep it at 45 minutes. So
I would
hope
request
everyone could
Dr.
still
Bharti.
follow.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone has. We will still take questions and do it after the second talk if there are any. And I would request Dr. Bharti to take over the proceedings for the second talk. Over to you, Dr. Bharti.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Nishit, for, the experience speaks. You are so clear. I think all the youngsters who are watching this, as well as the experienced consultants, have got clear idea about how to manage various types of CSF leaks. Thank you, Dr. Nishit. And thank you, Dr. Vikram, for moderating the session. Now the next session will be moderated by Dr. Jaskaran Singh. And the speaker will be Dr. Rajesh Yadav, who will be speaking about maxillofacial trauma. This, I think the ENT people have to take out this field also, because who else knows? We study the entire facial skeleton. Like nowadays, many of our ENT youngsters are taking this field. And to encourage that, AOI also is has done so many things to do that. So this branch of maxillofacial trauma, we have just kept ourselves to the nasal bone fractures, but we have to extend and do all the zygomatic and the maxilla, the mandible. And I think henceforth AOI will do in this field more work. And to introduce our speaker, I welcome Dr. Jaskaran Singh, who is an associate professor. Is working with Sri Guru Ram Das Institute of Medical Sciences, Amritsar, and he has done his fellowship in head and neck oncology, IFHNO's fellowship program at New York, and now he's pursuing his PhD in otology, and he has got various academic credits to him. And I welcome Dr. Jaskaran Singh to be the moderator for our next session. Over to you, Dr. Jaskaran.
Hello, thank you, ma'am, for your kind introduction. Ma'am, now I will introduce Dr. Very young and dynamic Dr. Rajesh to start with this presentation. Dr. Rajesh is currently working as an assistant professor of ENT in Bhagwati Hospital, Mumbai, and currently also holding a post of honorary secretary AOI. He has special interest in complex craniofacial fracture. Dr. Rajesh did his MS ENT in 2007, Mumbai, and same year he completed his DORL and FCPS. Dr. Rajesh has vast experience in academic activities. He was organizing secretary of first and second head neck surgical workshop held at Bhagwati Hospital, and also organizing secretary in ENT Explore 2013, and course coordinator for a prestigious TraumaCon. He has several publications under his belt and also author of many useful books for young ENT surgeons who are interested in craniofacial reconstructions. Now I welcome Dr. Rajesh to start his presentation.
Thank you, Jaskaran, for your kind words. Can you see my presentation?
No.
No?
Just seeing your
Okay.
Image on the screen.
Yeah. Now you can see my
Yeah.
presentation.
Yes. Now it is clearly visible.
Okay. 1 minute. So thanks, Jaskaran, for your kind words. At the onset, I'd like to express my gratitude to Dr. Bhargava sir and Dr. Kaushal Seth sir for making me a part of this lecture series. Thank you very much, sir. Let me tell you, when I was taking my END, my friends and my colleagues used to make fun of me. I mean, why are you taking a ENT? Was you're already getting some other this in? I was getting this op gynecs and this radiology in other part of Maharashtra, but not in Mumbai. So, but I always opted for ENT because I was getting in a JJ hospital. So they were making fun. यार क्या है ENT में? ENT में 4 surgery तो है. Then I realized over a time. And I was in a dilemma. I have done some wrong thing over. Then, over a period of time, I realized that this is a blessing in disguise. Actually, this is ENT is an evolving branch. So ENT has widened its origin from skull base to malignancies to autoneurology, and now is this maxillofacial trauma. But the sad part is, you see, not much ENT surgeons are doing this maxillofacial trauma. If I can say, only 2 to 5% of ENT surgeons are doing this facial fracture. Whenever such cases comes to them, they refer it to oromaxillofacial surgeon or a plastic surgeon. I mean, I have seen this in medical colleges also. They do a commando surgery, but when this patient comes to them, they refer it to your plastic surgeon. I don't know why. Are they not aware of anatomy of mandible? I think that's not the case. Or probably they are afraid that they are not aware of occlusions and all that. But if the plastic surgeon can be aware of occlusion, why not ENT surgeon? So I felt people are not accepting it. I think they don't have a willing heart to start doing this maxillofacial trauma. Once they have a willing heart, we can be a very good maxillofacial trauma surgeon. And I have my own reason why ENT surgeon should do a trauma, because it's a very simple surgery and easy surgery than your mastoid surgery and CSF leaks. It's a faster surgery. You get a result on a table itself, and anytime it gives more money than a mastoid and a T-plasties, because patient don't go for a window shopping since it's an emergency cases. And now there's a role of endoscope in facial fractures. So who can be more expert than ENT surgeon in endoscope? So we should do a facial fractures. So let's come to a topic. We all know that the face is divided into 3 parts: the upper face, the middle face, and the lower face. The lower face is mandible. The middle face is orbit, zygomatico-maxillary complex, maxilla, and nasoethmoids, and the upper face is frontal. We know this is an emergency situation, and we should always look out for associated injury like spine, brain, lung, and we have to tackle ABC. Before we go to each individual bone, we should be aware of few things. The general principle, that is occlusion, principle of bone healing, biomechanics of facial bone, and principle of fixation. So what do you mean by occlusion? Occlusion is relationship of upper teeth with lower teeth when they are in functional contact during an activity of mandible. Our aim of intervention or surgery is to restore the normal occlusion or pre-existing dental relationship. So we should be aware of teeth. We are aware of this, and we should be aware of the facial surface of the teeth. So what is a labial surface and what is a buccal surface? The teeth surface, the surface of the teeth which is facing toward the lip is called a labial surface, and the surface of a teeth which is facing toward the buccal is a buccal surface. Teeth which is facing toward the midline is a mesial, and teeth which is facing away from a midline is a distal. So we should be aware of 3 types of occlusion: type 1, type 2, and type 3. So what is type 1 occlusion? So in type 1 occlusion we have to see a molar. This is a first molar and this is a cusp. So this is mesiobuccal cusp of first maxillary molar occludes with mesiobuccal groove of first mandibular molar. This is class 1 occlusion. Okay. So you can see this in a video. So this is mesiobuccal cusp of first maxillary molar coincide with mesiobuccal groove of first mandibular molar. Okay, in class 2, everything comes anterior to the groove. So in class 2, you can see this, the mesiobuccal cusp lies anterior to the mesiobuccal groove. In class 3, the mesiobuccal cusp lies posterior to your groove. So class 3 occlusion is called as a mesial occlusion, and class 2 occlusion is called as a distal occlusion. So normally we see a molar teeth as a for occlusion, but in absence of molar teeth, we can see an incisor and cuspids. And if we have some problem with the teeth, we can take the help of Ware facets. Ware facets is when the teeth habitually comes together. We call nishani. What is an open bite? When teeth doesn't come together, it's called as an open bite. Okay, so this is anterior open bite and this is a posterior open bite. Seeing a patient, you should identify which fracture. Seeing the occlusion of the patient, you should identify which fracture the patient must be having. So let's find out how we can find out. Suppose there is a fracture of a condyle below the attachment of a lateral pterygoid. Okay. So this segment, because of the pull of the masseter and middle pterygoid, will have a cranial moment. Okay. And this will lead to shortening of this ramus, leading to premature posterior contact, leading to contralateral open bite. I can show you in this video. Okay, so say there is a fracture over, this is a medial, this is a shortening of your ramus, there is a premature occlusion on the same side and leading to open bite on the other side. If there is a bilateral condyle fracture, there will be a bilateral pull of a muscle and there will be anterior open bite. If there is a intracapsular fracture, there will be a there will be intracapsular edema, hematrosis, lengthening, leading to posterior open bite on the same side. There will be a open bite on the same side. Okay. In Lee-Ford fracture, since the maxilla is attached to skull base at obtuse angle, the fracture of maxilla, which occurs in a downward and backward displacement, results in premature occlusion of the posterior teeth, leading to anterior open bite. So the anterior open bite, if there is an anterior open bite, there can be a bilateral condyle fracture, bilateral angle fracture, or Lee-Ford fracture. And if there is a posterior open bite, there can be a contralateral condyle fracture and ipsilateral angle fracture. So we should be aware of principle of bone healing. We should always go for a primary bone healing, that is contact healing. So whenever there is a fracture, we have to reduce the fracture and then fix it. The fixation can be by closed reduction method or by a open reduction method. So we should be aware of IMF. What is IMF? This is a way of immobilization. So whenever there is a fracture in a long bones, we do a plaster. But when there is a fracture in a face, we cannot plaster it. So we use IMF for immobilization. Okay. So we normally use this arch bar for immobilization. Time period of IMF, we normally keep it for 3 weeks for immobilization. In some cases, you can reduce and increase the duration of IMF. If there is a teeth in a fracture line, you add 1 week. If there is a fracture at the symphysis fracture, you add 1 week. And if the age of the patient is above 40, you add 1 or 2 weeks. In children, you subtract 1 week. Then these are the wiring techniques: Gleamer's technique, eyelid wiring, Earth's ligature, and IMF screws. So when to do a close reduction? If there is a simple fracture with normal occlusion, you can go with a close reduction. Open reduction is done when there is a compound fracture, complex fracture, comminuted fracture, and simple fracture with change in a occlusion. What are the types of fixation? We can use a semi-rigid fixation, rigid fixation, non-rigid fixation. This is a non-rigid fixation we used to use in the past. We don't use nowadays. Semi-rigid fixation, in this we use a mini plates. And in rigid fixation, we use this reconstruction plate more often. Okay. Then there is something called load bearing and load sharing plates. In load bearing, the plate takes 100% of the functional load. So this is used in a comminuted fractures. And in load sharing, the plate and the bone share the functional load almost equally. So let's come on an individual fractures. First, fracture mandible. So if you see, the condyle is the most common fracture, followed by angle and then the parasymphysis. Then we should be aware of there is something called Champy's line. There are many forces which are acting on mandible. On a lower border, there is a compression force acting, and then upper border, there is a tension force acting. But in the the medial side, between two mental foramen, there is an additional force acting, which is called as a rotational force. And because of that, if there is any fracture between the two mental foramen, you have to use two plates, one at the upper border and one at the lower border, with two holes on either side of the fracture bone. If there is a comminuted fracture, in that case, you use a mini plate at the upper border and a reconstruction plate at the lower border. If there is an angle fracture, in that case, you use a mini hole plate at external oblique ridge. Single plate is enough. If there is a comminuted fracture, in that case, we using a reconstruction plate at the lower border and a mini plate at the upper border. This reconstruction plate is load bearing types. If there is a body comminuted fracture, again, we're going to use a reconstruction plate at the lower border and a mini plate at the upper border. Now some tips for fixation. For mandible, we use 2 mm system or 2.5 mm system. What do you mean by 2 mm system or 2.5 mm system? That means the size of your screws and your plate will be 2 mm. Okay. What will be the length of the screws? It will be 6 to 8 mm. Okay. At the lower border, we're going to use 8 mm. At the upper border, we're going to use 6 mm. We have to adapt the plate properly. If we are using a 2 mm system, we have to use a drill bit 1.5 mm, 0.5 less to create a hole. Drill bit should be perpendicular to the plate. You should have avoid repeated incision of drill bit, and you should always have a continuous watering during a drilling, and single give up should be appreciated. Now the approaches. So for symphysis, we have an intraoral approach, extraoral approach, or we can use an existing laceration. This is a video of a symphysis fracture. You can take an incision few mm away from the mucocutaneous junction, and there will be a muscle. You cut through that, you will be finding the fracture. Then use a 2 plate, one at the upper border and one at the lower border. You have to take care that you don't injure the mental nerve over here. Okay, what are the approaches for body and angle? For body and angle, we can use an intraoral approach, extraoral approach, and transbuccal system. So first, our extraoral approach, Wisden approach. So this is like your submandibular gland excision, your same procedure like some. So you take an incision 2 finger below the angle of mandible. You cut through the skin and subcutaneous tissue, and then you find the platysma. You cut the platysma, and you try to search the your marginal mandibular nerve. So you can see the marginal mandibular nerve over there. Okay. Once you find the marginal mandibular nerve, you retract this marginal mandibular nerve, and you palpate for your angle of mandible, and you give a cut at the masseter, and you will be directly at the mandible. Transbuccal approach. So transbuccal approach, if we are doing an intraoral approach for an angle, at times putting a screws and plate becomes difficult. So we can use a transbuccal approach. So we take a small incision on a face parallel to the relaxed skin tension line, Through this incision, trocar and a cannula is inserted and fracture site is reached. Plate is already placed intraorally over the determined site through intraoral approach. Trocar is withdrawn and retractor is applied. Adequate size of drill bit is inserted through the cannula and required size of hole is made in the bone. Through the cannula, screw is inserted using a self-holding screwdriver, and in this way, the adequate number of screws are inserted to secure the plate in a place. This is the video. So this is angle mandible, fracture angle mandible. We are taking an intraoral incision. We are finding out where the fracture is. This is the fracture site. We are putting a plate there. Okay. We are making a small incision at the outside. From there, we are putting a trocar. Now we are placing a retractor, and from outside we are doing a drilling. So we make an adequate hole, and from outside itself we put a screws. Condyle fracture. The question is, condyle fracture has to be operated by a closed reduction or open reduction? This is always a question. So there's a classification for management of a condyle fracture: class 1, class 2, class 3. Class 1 is ramus height shortening is less than 2 mm. Degree of fracture displacement is less than 10 degree. Class 2 is ramus height shortening is 2 to 10 mm. Degree of fracture displacement is 10 to 45 degree. Class 3 is ramus height shortening is more than 15 mm and degree of fracture displacement more than 45 degree. And how to find out what is the ramus height shortening? So what we do is we ask for a patient for a OPG. We draw a line from one angle to another angle, and then you draw a perpendicular line which passes through the condyle, and then you measure the two sides. That will determine the ramus height. If there is a shortening, you will come to know. And with the other X-ray, you will come to know the degree of displacement. So if there is a class 1, you have to go for a closed reduction. That means just a IMF. In class 2, you have to open. ORIF has to be done. In class 3, again ORIF. Okay, what are the approaches for this condyle? So there is an extraoral approach, intraoral approach. For extraoral approach, you can go by a retromandibular approach, by transparotid or retroparotid. Then preauricular approach, high submandibular approach, and intraoral approach by endoscopic assisted or use of existing laceration. Which incision we have to use? I mean, how to determine which incision we have to use? If there is a low subcondylar fracture, in that case, if there is an undisplaced fracture, we're going to use high submandibular approach. If it's a highly displaced fracture, in that case, we're going to use Hinz approach, which is your retroparotid retromandibular approach. In neck, we're going to use again retroparotid retromandibular approach, and in head fracture, we're going to use preauricular approach. And with expert hand, we can go by endoscopic approach. So what is high submandibular approach? High submandibular approach is you're taking an incision just 2 centimeter incision, incision just below the angle of mandible. You don't cut through the platysma. You create a tunnel till the zygoma with the mosquito, and you retract it. When you retract it, you're gonna find out your masseter muscle and a buccal branch of facial nerve. You have to preserve the buccal branch of a facial nerve. You cut through the masseter, you'll be directly on the mandible, and then you elevate, and you'll be directly on the fracture site, and then you can use these plates. This is nowadays what we do is with high submandibular approach, we use endoscopes. You know, our life become very easy with this. Okay, so this is high submandibular approach, endoscopic approach, and you can see the displacement of a condyle. So to reduce the fracture, what we do is through the angle, we put a IMF screw. This is the IMF screw. You can see there is a hole in the IMF screw. So we put a wire through it and we retract the angle so that we can able to reduce the fracture. And we are retracting it, and we are trying to reduce the fracture. So we are putting this deltoid plate over here. Okay, and you can see how the reduction which we are getting it with this. Okay. Then retromandibular retroparotid approach. So retromandibular approach is similar to your parotid surgeries. You have to mark an incision. This is angle of mandible. This is a sternocleidomastoid. You mark an incision between two of them. Take an incision, deepen it, go through the platysma, and go till the sternocleidomastoid. Find out your digastric. Once you find out your digastric, you retract all your you retract all your parotid in a retractor, and you can feel your angle of mandible over here. I can feel my angle of mandible. So when you retract your parotid, your facial nerve will go with it. And then you can take a directly incision on the pterygomasthetic sling there, and you will be directly on the mandible. So this is like this. You will be over here at the digastric, and you will retract the parotid, and you will be on the angle of the mandible. Preauricular approach. Preauricular approach, we take it for our head fractures. Okay. We take an incision along the curvature of pinna, and then you angulate it 45 degree upwards. Then you find your temporalis fascia, cut through the temporalis fascia. Your dissection will be below the temporalis fascia. Go down till you find your zygoma root. Cut through the zygoma periosteum. Move your condyle and find out where your condyle is, and you will be directly on the head of the condyle. This is the head, and we are doing our plating there. Then endoscopic condyle approach. This can be done, but it requires expertise. This can be done endoscopically, intraorally, without any external scar. So this is, we take an intraoral incision at the retromandibular region, expose the mandible, make a optical cavity. Okay, you introduce, there is a special retractor is available, so that you can make a optical field there. And this is the mandible, the proximal, the distal part. And when slowly, you'll find the proximal part of the mandible. This is the fracture part. We're using a hook to retrieve this fracture, this segment of the condyle. We are holding it with a lux forceps or a suitable forceps, and then by a transbuccal system, we are using this deltoid plate over here, and with transbuccal system, we are fixing this plate. So first, the proximal segment, and then after reduction, we are fixing the distal segment. Okay, so let's come to another bone. This is zygoma. Zygoma, we call it as a tripod fracture or trimolar fracture. We call it a tripod fracture because there is a fracture at the 3 articular point, that is zygomatico-frontal sutures at zygomatic maxillary buttress and infraorbital rim. So I'm not going to detail of a clinical feature, we can read it, but when to operate for a zygoma fracture. If there is a cosmetic defect, we have to go and intervene. If there is a functional disability, sometimes what happens is if there is a medially displaced zygoma fracture, it impinge on the carotid, and there will be a reduced decreased movement of mandible. So in that case, we have to intervene. This is a relative indication for intervention, like relieve the pressure on an infraorbital nerve. And if there is a floor fracture, we have to correct a diplopia or an ophthalmos. Principle of fixation. Whenever there is a zygoma fracture, we have to see 4 things. The 4th thing is there any cosmetic deformity or a functional deformity? If we have a cosmetic deformity and a functional deformity, we have to intervene. We have to see is it isolated fracture or multiple fracture. Isolated fracture can be treated by a closed reduction. If there is a multiple fracture, we need to open it. If there is a zygomatic fracture, you have to see it's a medially displaced or a laterally displaced. Medially displaced can be treated by a closed reduction, and laterally displaced can be treated by open reduction. And you have to see it's a complete fracture or incomplete fracture. So fixation techniques, we always use a mini plates over here. So what are the some tips? We are using 1.5 mm size plate for zygomas. The drill bit is of 1 mm size. We should place at least 2 screws through the plate on each side of the fracture side. And for zygomatic maxillary buttress, we use plate of shape like LTY. Okay. So there are buttresses. Suppose there is a panfacial fracture. So we don't have to plate each and every bone. We have to plate at the buttresses. So in a zygoma, the buttresses is zygomatic frontal sutures or infraorbital rim and zygomatic maxillary buttress. For zygomatic arch, if there is a medially displaced fracture, we have to do a closed reduction. So how can we do a closed reduction? So we know about Gillies temporal approach. Very briefly, the anatomy, we are aware that the temporalis fascia is attached to your zygomatic arch and the muscle runs below through it. So keeping that in mind, we take an incision along the hairline. We cut through the your temporalis fascia, make a plane between a temporalis fascia and a muscle. Go between this till you reach your zygomatic arch and use this retractor to elevate your zygoma. We can do it intraorally also, but I feel the Gillies approach is more safer than an intraoral approach. Then we can use a percutaneous approach. We call it as a towel clip reduction also. We mark the zygoma. You can see the depression over here. You take a small incision at the depression at the upper part, and you insert your can insert your this towel holding the towel holding one part inside, and then you make an incision over here and put the other side of the towel holding, and you can elevate it. Open approaches. These are the open if you have to approach zygomatic frontal suture, you have to go by supraorbital or lateral eyebrow approach. If you have to approach your zygomatic maxillary buttress, we have to go by maxillary vestibular approach, which is like your Cadwell approach. We have to approach an infraorbital rim, we can go by subciliary approach, infraorbital approach, mid-tarsal approach, and conjunctival approach. This is I'm not going into detail of this. Okay, now we'll come to maxilla. This is actually a video of a zygoma. Okay, this patient had a road traffic accident, and you can see there is a tripod fracture and on a CT scan. And for our advantage patient, we had a external scar. We opened from the external scar, and then we elevated the fractures, elevated the bone, and then we put a plate along the buttresses. So first is zygomatic frontal sutures, then at the infraorbital rim, then at the zygomatic maxillary buttress. Then we come to maxilla. We have a Leaford fractures. We don't have Leaford 1, 2, or 3. We have many other classification, but we don't go on a classification because when the patient comes to us, it doesn't follow any classifications. So Leaford 1 for a, Leaford 1 fracture is a transverse fracture through the maxilla occurring above the root of a teeth. Leaford 2 is a fracture which extends superiorly through the central maxilla and hard palate. The nasal bridge, maxilla, lacrimal bone, and orbital floor and orbital rims are involved. In type 3, it involves the bridge of a nose, middle orbital wall, lateral orbit, and maxilla and zygomatic arch. Entire face is unstable. Indication for surgery, again, if there is a cosmetic deformity and a functional deformity, we have to intervene. Again, there is a buttresses where we have to plate. There are buttresses for maxilla also. The buttresses is again your zygomatic frontal suture, then infraorbital rim, then your zygomatic maxillary buttress, then your nasomaxillary buttress. These are the buttress where you have to put your plates. The approaches are maxillary vestibular approach. For intraoral approach, we have a maxillary vestibular approach. Extraoral approach, we can go by lower eyelid approach like subciliary approach, subtarsal approach, and conjunctival approach, or by coronal approach. What are the correct sequence in which we have to operate? So first we have to plate the ZF suture line, then the zygomatic arch, then the plating of the infraorbital and a nasofrontal fracture, then the ZM buttress, and then, if needed, orbital floor. Principle of fixation. We have to reduce the impacted segment first, and for that we need to use this row maxillary disimpactant forceps or Hayton-Williams disimpactant forceps. And the moment should be downward to disimpact the pterygoid plate and anteriorly. So there should be a combination of downward and anterior motion. So we can see in this video. So this is anteriorly and downward. And this is for a palatal fracture when you have to bring the palate segment together. Principle of fixation, again, we are going to use for 1.5 adaptation plates. We can use a self-tapping screws. 6 mm or 4 mm screws are used. Drill bits is of 1 mm use. 1 mm. L plate or Y plate can be used at the maxillary zygomatic buttresses. Okay. Curved plates or linear plates has to be used for an infraorbital rim. And Y plates at the zygomatic frontal and nasofrontal buttresses. I'll skip through this. Then we'll come for a frontal bone fracture. So we all know the frontal sinuses is divided into anterior wall fracture, posterior wall fracture, and a floor fracture, or a combination of 3 fractures. Anterior wall fractures, you have to see it's displaced or not. If it's displaced, you have to see whether there's a cosmetic deformity or not. If there is a cosmetic deformity, if there's no cosmetic deformity, nothing has to be done. If there is a cosmetic deformity, you have to look for a nasofrontal duct injury. If there is a nasofrontal duct injury, you have to go for a ORIF or obliteration or cranialization or draft, whatever it is. And if there is no nasofrontal duct injury, just reduction is enough. And if there is no displacement, just observation is enough. So if there is an anterior wall fracture with cosmetic deformity, if it's within 1 month of a period, wall can be elevated and the reduction can be done and a plate can be put. But if it's beyond 6 months, if we can fracture the anterior wall, then that the wall can be removed and reversed and placed and fixed. But if we are not able to, fracture the segment, or if it's not possible, in that case, the repression has to be filled with or obliterated with bone cement, bone graft, mat post, or biopose, or titanium mace. What are the various approaches we can use? There can be an open approach by use of coexisting scar, brow incision, bicoronal incision, endoscopic approach, intranasally or external. What is an open approach? We used normally when it's associated with complication like CSF, rhinorrhea, mucocele, and exophthalmos. Done for comminuted anterior wall fracture. causing aesthetic defect. Frontal sinus fracture associated with other facial fractures. Brow. This is a picture for a brow approach. Endoscopic approach. So it can be intranasal and external. Intranasal endoscopic approach is to locate the frontal sinus ostium and plugging in if you have to do obliteration, usually combined with the open technique. External endoscopic approach is for isolated simple anterior table fracture, which is limited to the vertical face of the frontal bone, or isolated anterior table fracture, which is its repair for aesthetic purpose only. Posterior wall fracture. Posterior wall fractures are usually associated with anterior wall fractures. Two things need to be absorbed. Is there any CSF leak or is there any nasolacrimal duct injury? Posterior table fracture, you have to see whether the displacement is more than one table width. If yes, you have to see if there is a CSF leak. So if there is a CSF leak, you have to see it's a comminuted. It's a mild or a moderate. If it's a mild, you have to go for obliteration or crenalization. If it's moderate, you have to go for a ORIF and obliteration. If there is no leak, then we have to observe the patient for 7 days. So posterior wall fracture, mild comminuted fracture with nasolacrimal duct injury, obliteration of sinus is enough. If there is a posterior wall fracture with comminuted fracture more than 30%, in that case, you need to do a crenalization with pericranial flaps. So what is obliteration? What we do in obliteration, we remove all the visible mucosa. We use endoscope to remove all the visible mucosa. We occlude the nasofrontal duct and fill the sinus with material that forms a barrier between a sinus and a nasal cavity. What material we use? We use fat, pericranial flap, bone chips, temporalis fascia, tensor fascial lata, or bone cement. Crenalization. What are the indications? Posterior wall fracture that are severely communicated, CSF leak that fail to respond to conservative therapy after 5 days or are associated with dural tears. So in crenalization, the surgical approach is similar to your obliteration. The posterior wall is removed and the brain is expanded into the frontal sinus. The posterior wall may be used for anterior wall repair after removal of mucosa. Dura is repaired by a neurosurgeon by 5-0 nylon with pericranial flaps. So this is a patient with the cosmetic deformity, frontal bone fracture, anterior wall fracture. We are taking a brow incision. Okay, we are approaching the fracture segment. You should avoid injury to your supraorbital nerve and vessels there. See, this is the fracture segment. We are elevating it. We have elevated it and now we're going to plate it. We normally use 1 mm plate. We can use Y-shaped plate or T-shaped plate. The screw size is normally 1 mm. And this is a post-op picture. And then this is a parasymphysis fracture. Last 2 slides. Okay. So you can see there is a patient. The patient is having an open bite. You can see it because patient is having a symphysis fracture as well as a condyle fracture. The condyle fracture we have treated by IMF, and the parasymphysis fracture we have opened up. The incision is taken few mm away from the this margin. Gingiobuccal sulcus. We are cutting through this muscle, which is a masseter muscle. You can see this fracture segment. You can see the reduction which we are getting. We are adapting the plate. we are fixing this plate. So we are using a two plate, two hole on either side of the fracture line. That's the principle. And you can see this mental nerve. You always have to preserve that mental nerve. Now the suturing. Then there's a body fracture. We have gone by. So this is angle fracture. Patient is having angle fracture. We are going by extraoral approach. First, we are doing an IMF. After IMF, we normally do IMF in a local, and then we induce the patient. We take an incision few mm away from the angle of mandible. Then we are trying to find out where is the marginal mandibular nerve. At the lower border, we are putting two plates. We are putting a single plate with two holes on either side of the fracture line. And you can see the marginal mandibular nerve very well over here. This is the marginal mandibular nerve over here. So whenever you are drilling, you have to put lots of water so that, it prevents the necrosis of bone. You can see the marginal mandibular nerve very well over here. Thank you very much. For any queries, you can you go through my book, Handbook for Surgical Approaches, Maxillary Trauma. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh, for a wonderful presentation. I have two questions for you. Dr. Neeraj Shetty from Mumbai has asked, what are the alternatives to arch bar and eyelet wiring?
So we have IMF screws, so you don't have to. So actually, there is no alternative to arch bar. If there is a comminuted fracture, or if there is a complex fracture, in that the best immobilization method is arch bar. But if there is a simple fracture, in that case, you can use IMF screws. You can put two screws on either side, upper and a lower end, and you can pass a wire and you can immobilize the patient.
And second question again from Dr. Shetty. For unilateral angle mandibular fracture, mildly displaced on CT, but occlusion is maintained and no complaints of pain or difficulty in chewing. Should a surgical management be preferred or should just do a MMF?
So my idea is to go for a surgical this, because if you want to keep this patient for IMF, you're going to keep it for 3 weeks. Okay. But if you go for a surgical treatment, the patient will be out of MMF on a second day itself. So you are preventing, a trauma to a patient, unnecessary IMF for the patient for 3 weeks, which is, at times it's difficult for a patient. So, best for if I have to do, I'll go for a surgical, I'll fix the fracture.
Dr. Anjali is asking, what is the ideal time for doing surgery?
Sorry?
What is the ideal time for doing the surgery?
So whenever your anesthesia fellow is ready to give a case, you can do it. That's not an issue.
Okay. Dr. Rajesh, I have few questions to you.
Yes,
First,
sir. Yes, sir.
If you have a unilateral condyle fracture, and it is not interfering with occlusion, the patient is maintaining the occlusion, do you always do a reduction for that fracture, or can we leave that fracture?
So again, sir, you have to, if it's a high condyle fracture, if it's a head fracture, you can, so you have to see whether you can plate the fracture or not, because at times in a head fracture, if it's the segment is too small that you cannot put a plate also there. In that case, you leave it. Okay. But whenever it's possible, I'm going to plate the fracture, because that will prevent a IMF. And that IMF, that will unnecessary, that period of 15 days or 21 days is, is spared for the patient. So it can be treated by IMF also. I'm not saying to that, but in that case, you have to, you have to rehabilitate the patient very well. So there are ways of how to rehabilitate the patient. So after what happens is, when we operate on a patient and then we forget to rehabilitate the patient. So we have to rehabilitate the patient.
And if you have a unstable fracture of angle of mandible, do you prefer still you prefer a transbuccal, or you will go for open approach for unstable fracture of angle of mandible?
So transbuccal approach is actually an open approach. Are you talking about external approach or you're talking about intraoral approach?
External and external versus transbuccal.
Yeah, so I'll always go for an intraoral approach, whatever it is. I can able to put a reconstruction plate and as of now I have able to put a. But if I'm not able to do, I'll take an external incision. That's not a harm in that.
So I think there are no more questions, but if some time permits, can I have one or two more questions?
Yes, please.
So Dr. Rajesh, for a long time, personally, I'm also doing this trauma, but I'm struggling with one thing, that is naso-orbital complex fracture.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you deal with the tendon fractures of naso-orbital complex? So if there is
actually, this is a topic of itself. It's a full. So you have to see this is NOE1, NOE2, or NOE3. So you're talking about NOE3. In that case, you have to pass that wire. You have to require a big segment. In that case, this segment is. The tendon fracture is there. There is a avulsion of tendon. You're talking about avulsion of tendon, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, there will be a comminuted fracture at the nose. In that case, you have to pass a wire from the tendon and from the same side of the bone and remove it from the other side of this and get it back, and you have to reduce it. So I have got a video. I can share it to you personally later on. How to do it then.
And in case of, you always go for a 3-point fixation for zygomatic fractures, or a 2-point fixation?
So 2-point fixation, that depends upon the stability of the fracture. If I feel the fracture is not stable enough, I'll go for a 3-point fixation. That's not an issue.
So I think just check any more questions.
Jaskaran, there are two
Dr.
questions.
Rajesh, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Vikram, can I ask Dr. Rajesh 2 questions?
Yes, we can finish with
Yeah.
Dr. Rajesh, and then we'll go back to Dr. Nishit.
There are two more questions
Rajesh.
for Dr. Rajesh.
Yeah, ma'am, please.
Fracture of the floor of the orbit.
Yeah.
If not in ophthalmos, do you do anything, or only
no? So if there is a floor fracture and there is no enough thalmus, there is no diplopia, and if you have to see what is the fracture. I mean, if it's the involvement of the fracture site, if it's more than 30% or more than 30%, then you have to, eventually that patient may have an ophthalmos. In that case, you have to intervene, and you can do by endoscopically also. You can by a Cadwell-Luck approach, or intranasally you can put a Metpor there or a Surgicel. Just keeping a Surgicel over there is enough, and then you put a glue there. I got a video, but if you
I've done two endoscopic. I've done.
So you should be aware of endoscopically also, and you should be aware of external approach also, subciliary as well as conjunctival approach, because you at times when its defect is more than 50%, in that case you may have to go external approach.
So there are a few more questions, Dr. Rajesh. So
Yes,
there are 2 questions for Dr. Rajesh Jain from Bhilwara. One is asking, what do you do in a non-union fracture after surgery? And
Non-union
second, if you are
fracture.
using implants,
Which non-union fracture of which?
it is not mentioned, but in general, I think he's asking about if there is non-union.
So non-union, that means we have gone somewhere wrong. We have not done a proper reduction. In that case, we have to open up again, reduce the fracture, open up, refracture it, bring the reduction, and put a plate again.
And second is he's asking what to do when implants get infected. I think he's telling about dental implants.
No. It can be infected again if you are using steel plates, or if you're using a very loose, if your screw is not tight enough, and if there is an infected bone there, or if there is a source of infection there, it can get it can be come out. So in that case, you have to, after your period of immobilization and the period of healing is over, you can just open it and remove the plate and the screws.
Uh, yeah. So can I ask one more questions from Dr. Mohit Loania and
Yeah,
Dr.
please,
Rajesh, and
please.
also asking about what to do when you have a dentist patient. The same question is from my side also. So
So
how do you take when you're going to take a dentist patient or the patient who is not having the premolars, maxillary or mandibular, and then what do you do to know about how to take occlusion in those patients?
So we have to ask the patient, is he really worried about this? Actually, you know, we have to ask the patient, is the patient is having a denture? If we have a denture, we can take a help of a dentist. We can ask him to put a splint there, and we can put the denture, and we can fix it by wiring, circummandibular wiring, and fix that. And you can buy a IMF. We can put by a gunning splint. We call it a gunning splint. Okay, that's a way of doing an immobilization. But if there is a very, if it's a comminuted fracture, and if we can put a reconstruction plate there, we can open and put a reconstruction plate.
And again, one more question from Dr. Neeraj Shetty.
Shetty.
You should use the fixation, reuse the fixation screws. I don't think
Ideally we should not use it, but
not use that.
in India, it's, yeah.
It should not be used.
Yeah, we should not be using it.
So I think we have covered all the questions, and there are a lot of compliments to you.
Thank you very much.
Participants, and really thankful for a very nice presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaskiran, for moderating this session. Rajesh, it was an excellent talk, and it was a bird's view of what all we can do in maxillofacial trauma. And who refer the cases to you now?
So actually, my ENT surgeon refers cases to me. At times, dental surgeons refer cases, and at times we do together with the plastic surgeon. They call it for their condyle fractures, because a condyle fracture is so complex fracture. Even your plastic surgeon and oromaxillofacial, because they are so worried about your facial now. So if you master this endoscopic approach, you're away from your facial now injury.
Yeah, that's correct, Rajesh. Actually, your first slide, why we should not take up this field, was very good. Yeah, it was the road traffic accident, and many trauma cases are there. And in the institute, in the medical college, I think the ENT surgeons are there. So if at all they take up this field, rather than calling the facial-maxillary surgeon from outside, they can do this work. And I think there is one Indian Society of Facial Trauma, Aesthetics and Reconstructive Surgery of Otorhinolaryngologist.
Yeah, I'm the president of it, ma'am.
But I have one request to you. Ma'am, you should promote this field more. Like when we started in our institute 8 years back, this surgery, at that time plastic surgeon was not available, and dental hospital was pretty far. So we have to learn this technique, and 8 years back we started. But eventually our department, ENT department, became the ENT surgeons became the head of a trauma unit. So now even plastic surgeons are there, but all the trauma, whatever comes, ENT sees first, and then we decide which to go where. So the same thing, I would request you to promote this field more, because it is very essential as part of a head neck surgery, or as a part of if we can do a reconstructions of our own in any reconstructive surgeries or any cancer surgeries. Definitely this field should be more promoted because since you are a president, I think you should promote this field more as a part of a curriculum of our ENT surgeons.
Yeah, we'll take this. I think that.
And very small request to Bharti ma'am and to Kaushal sir and to Bhargav sir, we should always include one session of this in all these conferences of if that can happen, that will be a big thing for us actually.
Yeah, we'll do that in a executive committee meeting.
Yes.
We'll have this talk and then we'll put forward and take the approval of all the members. And we are really for upbringing of our field. We should extend to other areas.
Thank you, ma'am.
And because see, we are all head and neck surgeons, we know the everything. Like we do mandibulectomy, we do what you said, maxillectomy day, and endoscopes. We are used to it. So that I think we should not leave this. We should encourage our people to take this field. That we'll do. And I think Vikram, you have some questions for Dr. Nishit. Is it there still?
There are two questions for Dr. Nishit.
Dr. Nishit, sir?
Yeah, I'm here.
Is there?
Yeah, the first question is your take on turbinate excision based on the location of the leak. This is from Dr. Bhuvna Ganeshan from Sikandrabad.
So if it is cribriform leaks, then we would not take the turbinate. If it is a sphenoid sinus leak, lateral recess, then we take the turbinate.
Okay. The second question is, do you use fluorescein in every case to confirm the site of the leak, especially if there are any multiple leaks?
No. So we use fluorescein only in very few cases, as you mentioned, where we are not sure of the site of leak, or occasionally in revision cases.
Okay. So,
Sir, just one question from my side. So what is your take on tree muscle tissue as a graft for closure, sir?
For muscle?
Muscle, yes, sir.
So muscle we used to use.
Not a pedicle one.
Yeah. So muscle used to be used a lot, say even 20, 25 years ago. And at that time, actually, was when we were residents that Dr. Kirtane would tell us that the muscle that was used earlier would sort of become a little gelatinous mass. It would not remain as a solid thing, whereas fat would remain as fat, as a more of a solid thing, and less of degradation. And so from those very early days, we were used to using fat. So we would not like to use muscle.
I think that's all, no? Vikram, any other questions?
no, madam. All questions for Dr. Nishit Shah have been answered by him, and a lot of compliments from the attending delegates also about his presentation and his answers, which are very satisfactory.
Yes.
So we have had about 300 plus delegates attending today live.
Yeah. It was a nice evening we had, academic session. Thank you, Dr. Nishit. Thank you, Dr. Rajesh, and our moderators, Dr. Vikram and Dr. Jashkiran. Kaushal,
Yes, ma'am.
we'll wind up?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, then Samir is there?
Everyone. Good night.
Bye,
Thank
bye.
you.
Take care.
Thank you
Bye.
very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Samir.
Bye.
Vimlesh?